Yes, during the reading of my speech, you will be watching a film from Kenya without the music and without the words. The Church, as the group that believes and experiences the kingdom of God on earth, must deal with the phenomenon of evil and the suffering of humanity in the same world that God created us all good, Genesis 1:25. This suffering that the world experiences today only came after the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. For the Church to remain relevant to the life of her people, she must respond to their grievances. Even where she cannot give solutions, the Church must at least give some answers to the many questions in the society. This paper is an attempt to respond to such social cries of humanity from a perspective of a missionary who has lived and worked in Africa for the last 35 years. Poverty, historical and contemporary applications. Africa, the largest and second most populous continent in the world, is one of the richest continents of this world. But unfortunately, her people remain to be some of the poorest in the world. The numerous natural and valuable resources found in Africa should make her one of the leading economic powers in the world. But this has remained to be far from the reality. In fact, Africa has done better in making others rich than she has in doing anything else. While many definitions of who a poor person is has generally meant one whose income is below the specified poverty line, or one who is unable to acquire the most basic needs of whatever level they are in, be the spiritual, economic, material, academic, cultural, social, information, health, and the like. It is clear that in most cases, poverty is measured in economic levels. As research has shown, poverty is definitely deeper than lack of money. And thus, with her multi-faced reality, we can in short define poverty as a state of deprivation of essentials. As the world has come to terms with accepting only definitions given by the voices of the people living in poverty, especially since the World Bank editions of the Voices of the Poor, my experiences in Africa have confirmed that only seeing or hearing what the suffering people consider to be poverty can be an authentic definition. I have met persons living for days without food and having no hope for getting any soon, and others living without any clothing or very limited clothing to the extent of just using a piece of cloth to only cover their very essential private parts, a privilege left only for adults. I have witnessed in many areas people drinking the same water that their animals are drinking, bathing and defecating in, and at the same time where other humans are bathing and doing their laundry. Although this sounds frightening, I have considered other cases as worse, especially during the drought seasons, when many villages don't even have dirty water to drink. They wait daily for the rains to come, even when it is not the rainy season. Some pray to God He may offer rain to at least their neighboring lands, so that the floods coming from those lands could at least reach them. I have witnessed others being given seeds by the government to plant, and due to their status of extreme poverty, they decide to eat the medicated seeds, only fit and especially meant for planting, for their survival. Others have no hospital or medical dispensaries, as they are rich because of different reasons, and so they have devised ways of threatening themselves. and to what extent can they do that, or what diseases and illnesses can they really treat, while even the best equipped hospitals have challenges with some illness and diseases. Others have no house or shelters to live in, and so they wait for their shops to close so that they can lodge on their porch. Unfortunately, during the rainy season, especially in equatorial Africa, they will have to sleep standing because the waters overflow their beds. While all this can be termed as extreme poverty cases, these communities I just mentioned have people they consider rich and others poor. Causes of poverty in Africa. Despite the many ways that the world has worked on to help alleviate poverty and great achievements made on the same, poverty is still very vibrant in the world, and especially in the global south. 15 years after the Millennium Development Goals were launched by the United Nations, 2000 and 2015, more than 1 billion people are still living in extreme poverty. As one United Nations Development Program report states, the human deprivations witnessed in the world come amidst globalized progress and development, says the same report. What is wrong with the African governments after a full generation, 50 years, has passed since most of her countries attained independence? Many would ask, why should the Africans continue suffering to the extent of going hungry while they have owned a lot of wealth, as earlier mentioned, and considering the fact that their lands are some of the largest and most fertile others would carry? The short answer to such queries would be that most of this is being taken by the developed world, some of it during the colonial era, and some of it during these periods, a neocolonialism. As Professor Mugabe puts it, Africans produce new materials and each crops for export, whose prices are set by the consumers abroad. The earnings are used to purchase manufactured goods from the same countries where the raw materials are exported at prices which are set by the producers. Africans remain as double losers, being unable to set prices for their raw materials nor for the manufactured goods they import. With this kind of relationship of exploitation, many African governments end up getting international loans to run their budget deficits, which they pay with whatever profit they are to get from the produce of their countries. The inevitable almost always happens because the African governments are usually not able to pay these Western loans that carries very high interest rates. Over time, the African governments start working for the Western countries that lend them the money they are using to run their countries. This is especially seen in the control of these Western countries over the African governments, markets, policies, leadership, politics, and the like. The same problems are duplicated in the lives of their citizens, who remain as slaves in their own so-called independent countries, because even after working so hard to produce for their country's markets, they are paid very little for their produce, because their governments cannot sell anything at any good price, nor can they stop paying the borrowed loans. This means the African governments are not able to uplift the lives of their citizens, and neither can the citizens uplift their own lives. While that is only one form of justice that helps poverty continue to exist in Africa, many more factors can be identified. Civil wars and conflicts in Africa have contributed in a big way. The erupt out of ethnic prejudices failed political institutions, and need to control the existing natural resources, all of which reduce the workforce, added to the size and cost of the military, the hinder development, among other negative effects. Excessive use and abuse of drugs and alcohol by the younger and productive generations is reducing the workforce of African countries. That is supposed to help uplift their countries' economic growth. Irresponsible governance and corruption in many African governments is rampant, and the results are in many ways the misuse of government resources meant to benefit the citizens, an action that is duplicated from the highest positioned leaders of the national governments to the lowest local government ones. Inequitable distribution of resources and benefits, as well as mismanagement of human resources and material, is an everyday activity in Africa, which reduces the potential a very large population that could have otherwise helped in their nation building. The inability to foster good health programs and the inequitable distribution of health facilities and health-related information has led to the loss of a very prime lives in Africa, starting with the dreadful three diseases: HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Some factual examples can show how dreadful this health factor is. Among the 40 million people infected with HIV/AIDS worldwide, 26 million of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. This disease leaves about 12 million orphan children with no family or with their aged guardians, who in most cases are their aged and non-working grandmothers. Every year, 9 million people get infected with tuberculosis, the second single worldwide killer disease after HIV and AIDS, of which 95% of TB-related deaths occur in low and middle-income countries, most of which remain in the global South Africa included. Most HIV/AIDS patients are highly suspected to getting TB, and that is why, according to the World Health Organization Global TB report of 2014, TB remains to be a leading killer of HIV-related deaths, which happens within 10 years of catching TB. Terrorism and Muslim-related killings are household problems in the world, but today, more so in today's Africa, where a third of the population is Muslim. Radical Islamic groups like the Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Boko Haram in West Africa, and ISIS at Al-Qaeda in North Africa and Middle East are terrorizing Africa, and in a big way. In this last decade, this terrorism has been seen to increase. According to the U.S. Homeland Security Institute, young people usually enter terrorist and extremist groups by being born into a radical environment, forced into it, recruited or persuaded, and self-radicalization. The radicalization of young people in Africa is mainly by Muslim extremist teachers, religious leaders, family, friends, and others. The recruitment done directly through religion in schools or through social media. Some join the extremist groups mainly for money, but others factors like mentally unstable individuals and politically humiliated activists, as well as misinformed and radical Muslim believers who think that the world should be a Muslim one only, are in the increase. The recent terroristic and extremist attacks in the western and eastern parts of Africa are new and very frustrating to the Christians, as well as Muslim communities who have peacefully coexisted as citizens of their nations without any problems until now. The casualties of such attacks are so many, and a call for a harmonized and corroborative living of Muslims and Christians is needed for such groups to lose their foothold in Africa. While the governments and international cooperation groups are working on the statistics of human poverty and other forms of related suffering, I feel that the Church should remind them that poverty and human suffering are not a statistical issue, but rather a human issue. According to the 2014 UN Millennium Development Goals report, poverty was reduced by half. But the problems I have seen in my 35 years in Africa are more or less the same. For example, Africa still carries the largest number of poor countries in the world, and the poverty reduction strategies devised for her are by non-Africans or Africans living outside Africa, which is probably the reason Africa still has the poorest people in the world. Unless the Africans are given the opportunity to deal with their problems in their own ways, and everyone else is to be the only to give them the support they shall need, then this situation will definitely continue. The rights of the Africans are often infringed on, but there is no one to help, because those who are supposed to help are also part of the exploiters. The poor Africans in most cases do not even know that they have a right for their government to take care of them and to help them come out of their current state of extreme poverty. The dehumanization of the image and likeness of God in Africa is frightening. While the Church has been in Africa since the early 1st century, when St. Mark, the patron saint of the African continent, started his ministry and evangelization in North Africa. Social justice and transformation. The question asked by most poor people, who I confess have very great faith in God, is, why are we poor and others are rich, yet we all belong to the same God, who owns everything on earth? With this question in mind, I then remember Christ saying, the poor will always be with you. And that reminds me that there will be always be diverse lives, some with wealth and others without, some with more faith and others with less, as the letter of James tells us. Listen, you beloved brethren, has not God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to them that love him? But you despise the poor. Do not rich men oppress you. If you fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. To fight poverty in Africa, the Church has to act. And because if it does not, then there is not much hope for the African people, both Orthodox and non-Orthodox. Personally, having come from Europe, where much such poverty as described in this paper is unheard of it, in the 21st century, my point of view on what to do when it comes to poverty has been only one: help as much as you can. This has made me to dispatch so many money, even money meant for other projects, to help such situations, so that I could help reduce the pain and suffering of such groups or individuals, even in the slightest. My archdiocese has searched for funds to create clinics and ask the government doctors to be placed in the same for areas that have health issues. We have created boreholes in areas where water is being lacking, initiated feeding programs where children cannot go to school due to hunger, built schools where none existed, built homes for groups or individuals where necessary, given clothes to different groups and individuals where such are needed. offer food to individuals, slums, villages, or even regions, and such humanitarian projects. Many have thought of my method as absurd and unprofessional, but my take has been not to think of what textbook professionals, with all due respect, are saying, but what 4 groups of professionals before me that have lived and experienced poverty have to say. These professionals of poverty are Christ, his apostles, and the church fathers, the African traditional way of life, and the specific suffering people I am dealing with at that very moment. Christ is the one professional that I fully trust and work for, and who created these suffering people, and those who are well off too. And so what he says and advises is paramount for any minister of the world, including myself. As a clergyman and as a hierarch of the Orthodox Church, I represent Christ, and therefore what I see and hear is what Christ has made me see and hear for a specific purpose, so that he can then use me to take care of his flock. While Christ was on earth before he started his ministry, he made it very clear where the poor were placed in his mission through the words of prophet Isaiah, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the broken-hearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight that are bruised, to preach and that the acceptable year of the Lord. It is with this boldness that I take his words and why he came to the world. I also see how he worked by preaching the word, healing the sick and suffering, and feeding the hungry, among other humanitarian and pastoral acts best seen in the Synoptic Gospel. For Christ, any help according to the needy person was help according to him, as he says. In truth, I tell you, in so far as you did this to one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it to me. Christ taught that only practicalities work for the situations of the poor like him, coming to the world to save the spiritually poor humanity. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Let us love not in word or speech, but in deeds and in truth.